Welcome back to Vendée Radio. Today it is January the 24th, the feast of St. Timothy, Bishop and Martyr, who we mentioned last time that I had Mr. Jason Craig and Mr. Marc Barnes on Vendée Radio to discuss guilds. It is the year of grace 2023. We were discussing the role of St. Timothy, his filial relationship with St. Paul in the context of the familial nature of guilds in Christendom. Mr. Craig, Mr. Barnes, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm really glad that we could organize part two here, because I think we had a great exploration of the guilds as an institution of the Christian social order in the last broadcast. And we talked about guilds as embodying and upholding a practice-based Catholicism as voluntary lay associations by which the church could be true to her communal nature. And we talked about the origin of the guilds in Europe, the family nature of the guilds, their economic function, and then finally on guild piety. So I'd like to first begin then by talking about the guilds and a very important principle of Catholic social doctrine, which is solidarity. Recent scholarship, which is often described as revisionist scholarship, is beginning to emphasize this more, the guild's importance in the social order as part of a moral economy, as operating guild charity. So, Mr. Barnes, perhaps you could offer your thoughts here on the importance of the guilds for the function of charity within the Christian social order.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this was a reason for quite a few of the guilds in their origins, especially the care of widows and orphans. So throughout Spain and France, you'll find, if you dig deep enough, that often these voluntary lay associations, before they became specified to different trades, as we tend to understand the guilds now, could be organizations of neighborhoods, of certain streets, for the sake of covering burial costs for widows and widowers, for members within that group. And that wasn't simply the burial, the funeral, which of course is a noble thing to do, but also for the care of those bereaved, those left behind, widows and orphans, which is of course a traditional teaching of the church. I think somewhere, is it James, I think, calls true religion keeping oneself unstained from the world and taking care of widows and orphans. So that in order to effect the gospel, once again, as we spoke before, the Catholic Church in its laity turns towards the creation of institutions, of customs, and not simply to individual acts of spontaneity. So it is so good to take care of widows and orphans that we don't simply leave it to chance, as it were, but to a definite institution. And what this meant was, for the Catholic, that guilds in their origins were also often joining in communal prayer for the souls of those who had died as a work of charity specifically. So it wasn't merely that membership within an organization, a confratas, whatever it was. It wasn't simply that membership meant a material contribution, though it did mean that, but also the promise of a spiritual contribution. So you would say a certain number of masses for the dead as part of your obligation as a member of this guild. So, or rather, a proto guild, I should say. So the works of charity weren't limited to burial and death and prayers for the dead, but often you found this as a beginning place. And what this effectively did is it created centers of power within Europe, by which I mean property, money, and resources, as well as people, that had as their primary focus the extension of virtue and grace into the whole society, which meant that, this could be quite literal sometimes, where you have historical examples of money being gathered in preparation for funeral costs and such, and then actually seeing developments in which members of the guild were able to take loans from those organizations for their purposes without interest, for instance. So you can see already how organizing for the sake of mutual charity by its nature doesn't stop there, but creates the kind of centers of lay power that can help the laity in their lives and in spreading the gospel in other ways as well.
Yeah, I was fascinated, or last time, I don't know, it was at the beginning of the podcast where we were talking about the history of it. And Mark, I was tending much towards the trade-based guilds, which is in our imagination, that's still, I think actually probably also because I was reading the book that Mr. Howard and I were reading, The Art of Solidarity in the Middle Ages, which is specific to England. Yeah. And the English tended to one, I love how many associations they always start locally, tiny little, even competing in a very tiny space. I read the book Anglo-Papalism, and just how often they're reproducing little guilds. I mean, constantly. It's an English thing, and how often they do associate it with, well, this is what we do as a trade, which would have not been surprising because in a small area, your normal economic activity is how you're relating to one another. But the sanctification of that, where yes, to ritualize the fraternity that you proclaim by your faith, to bring really ritual ceremony, so the feast, and then to bring the very practical money and even lending and the care. I just flipped open with this book. You can flip open to any other page and get an example of that. But this is the Goldsmith Guild, wrote in 1448. If by chance some master or journeyman or mother or wife or sister of a goldsmith should happen to die, the captains or councils are required to call together all the goldsmiths and to go to honor the deceased and accompany him to his burial themselves. And this must be done for the small and the great, whatever family they belong to.
That's right.
I thought how many Catholics, when we talk about trying to live an integrated life, our faith being integrated, what we try to do is just make everything sort of Catholic themed. Sure. The way we might slap a saint on a mug, which has always been a bizarre practice to me as a convert. I never quite understood that. New Polity doesn't do that, I'm sure. I don't know. But to just put...
Not today.
Just checking. But to just put a crucifix on our desk or sanctify it, but they really did integrate, where the goldsmith, instead of goldsmithing that day were expected, all of them, to be at a funeral, even if for anybody who belonged to the guild itself. And the other interesting thing, since our last conversation related to your question, is that how often they were men and women. That they're very much called fraternities, but how often they did. I almost found that strange, to be honest, how frequently, because they were very often economic, but how often women were members. And it was because, as you dig deeper, because the spiritual and corporal works of mercy and the spiritual and corporal care of a local community was the ultimate purpose of the guild. So naturally, that does spill out and sort of breathe in and out with the economic and professional reality. I don't even want to call them professionals, the craftsmen, the artisans. It breathed in and out naturally of going outward and in, that really they were the life of a community, of making sure that the culture and the work of the people was brought in and sanctified through these guilds, and then outward they went back and forth, and that was fascinating.
Yeah, Jason, you said you mentioned the spiritual and corporal works of mercy as being the activities of the guild and the proto guild, confratus, confraternity, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's quite right. That's what struck me. And maybe for people who are listening to this that might not get a sense of the scope of the kind of charitable activities that were the bread and butter of these lay organizations, maybe this will be of some help. In Spain and in Mexico as well, there are confraternities where membership, part of what membership means is that if another member is sick, someone is obliged to sit up with them while they're sick all through the night to be their caretaker. And this is also true of godparentage relationships, especially in Latin America. And another one that immediately springs to mind is there are several lay organizations that were developed specifically for the ransoming of captives. So you see this in Spain, especially during the period in which we were at war with Islam more aggressively. And one of the chief instigators of conflict was kidnapping and then charging a ransom for Christian slaves. And so instead of, again, leaving this to chance and leaving it to spontaneity, the lay genius is for institution building. And so it naturally said, well, if we're going to be ransoming people, well, we might as well make a thing of it. And so they developed particular devotions, which you can imagine when your work is ransoming captives, there's all sorts of good devotions to choose from. And they did, and they made that the necessities of life into a sort of liturgy of communion. And that, I think, is very inspiring. And we're going to go into that more, I suppose, as we go on. But I think it's worth saying that the historical research is really the tip of the iceberg here, because while we do have, and another one I should mention is just hospitality to travelers. So the way in which membership within a guild, even a local guild, often meant, I was just reading letters from Alcuin where he's encouraging different people to build houses for taking in strangers, for travelers. And the guilds were also played a major part in simply that work of mercy, that hospitality. And I think there's a way in which it's just like organizing the body of Christ for the performance of the spiritual and corporal works of mercy just makes good sense. And so, of course, we see it within our history.
I think I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to, this has been an emphasis in these discussions, is that often the revisionist history of it tends to work by taking some singular part of a guild's economic life, usually in the later Middle Ages, and then arguing the kind of, for a certain cynicism within it, like, well, what they really wanted was for the tanners not to have any competition. Mm-hmm. And so they could fix prices and wages and such by having a sort of monopoly over a trade organization. And to some extent, that's true. And I think we should be willing to say, yes, absolutely, they're trying to control, how this particular work went. But if you look at it from its origins, what you see is that this comes from a desire to protect and keep a community first. And then it's almost by incident that the communities you protect end up sharing in the life of common trade. Confraternities were often done by neighborhood, but it also was the case that neighborhoods were often of similar tradesmen. I mean, people who work together tend to live together. And so there's a organic development, if you will, from simply trying to incarnate the works of mercy in a reasonable way, and then this moving into stable relationships of art and trade.
Yeah, and I think there is a desire, and the reason where I am doing what I'm doing, that if we live in a certain way, that our Catholic lives will organically, because of grace and nature intertwining in that beautiful whatever, we'll just be a better community, and we'll solve a lot of these problems because we're living differently from a digitized artificial world and whatever. But the guilds, they were not, or in that sense, organic, meaning we can just passively let a couple generations go by and then we will be good at being charitable. They mandated it, they specified it,
right,
they ritualized it, and then they renewed it consistently with one another. And yeah, they would put in their statutes, if you're joining this just for financial advantage and we find out, you're done, you're out. Mm-hmm. And so there's an awareness that, yes, this is only an economic, the transaction, that's the reason I'm doing this. And then also, it definitely at the beginning of this book, says to interpret the guilds is always a political interpretation, always. And the two sides of it are, well, the guilds represent a weak state. So if there's a strong state, then you don't need the guilds.
Yeah.
And then there's another reading. No, it's actually could be a strong state, or either way they can read it depending on what they're defending. And the same is true if you're coming at it from just market forces. Well, sure, they're just controlling and fixing the prices, or they're just keeping out competition, and therefore they're stagnated in their archaic way of life. And
well, you see how this works is everything is either proto-socialist, proto-capitalist, or proto-state.
It's never a family that's caring for one another in a community.
Well, and de Lubac makes this point in his medieval exegesis, where he speaks about how the medievals had their life, had their society as what he calls a complete act, which is to say it wasn't proto anything, right? They're not like, well, we're doing some things that seem a bit socialist, but they're not quite socialist yet, right?
We're getting there. We're getting there. Give us a century.
We have this, arrogant way of taking the monoliths of modernity and then seeing all of history as sort of breathless anticipations of what eventually would resolve itself into, surprise, surprise, us.
Yeah, we're obviously the pinnacle. My son asked me this the other day. If we had not gotten here, we being of European descent, if we had not gotten here, would the Indians the Native Americans, would they have figured out, I don't remember what it was, like guns or something. And I would say, well, I hope not. But I don't, but we had to have the discussion that it's not as if every civilization, if left to itself, would become us.
Right.
And that we are the mature and grown up man. That was to have that conversation with him is hopefully keep him from starting a lot of wars.
Yes, good for him.
We'll see. But yeah, that we're always trying to defend this position. And I would say if I'm reading backwards into it from something, it's certainly the thesis of this primary book, or this book here, The Art of Solidarity, is how, we as Christians, our actual identity, not a theme that we're taking up, not a helpful understanding, but our actual identity is a family, as brothers, right. Which is actually goes beyond and is harder than friendship, which, in a Aristotle, Aquinas, friendship being the highest form of love. This is actually not chosen. We're brothers and we live here together. Mm-hmm. Anyone who has brothers know that that doesn't mean immediate concord, but it can mean fraternal peace. Mm-hmm. Right. So how do we do that? It seems to be a very practical, encompassing, functional, self-renewing, self-regulating, localized method for me as a male, as a father. The refreshing part when I read about the guilds is, how do I serve and love God? Oh, you serve and love my neighbor, and your brother. Who? Him. Right. It makes it, and here's how.
Yeah.
If he's sick, do this. If his mother dies, do this. I think that's there is something refreshing and practical about it.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Craig, you're quite right. I mean, Rosser grounds this solidarity in an Aristotelian framework, you might say, by talking about friendship. As you say, it gets perfected or transcends that, but the book is full of tangible examples that Catholics today might draw from, be inspired by, in how to instantiate a similar spirit. He mentions how a guild in Lincoln, founded in 1354, when a member was out of work, the other brothers and sisters would take turns to offer him or her a meal each day in their homes. Well, just, very practical measures that among, small groups of people, as you've pointed out there. He says at one point, I think, that the numbers in most fraternities were between 50 and 100. So they were always at a relational level, a realistic level by which you could actually have personal relationship with those numbers. It was subsidiarity in practice. And that's what lay behind this mutuality, these actions of peace and love. And he says the guild feast was held for the promotion of love and charity among the members. And as you point out, Mr. Barnes, when you read scholarship, you have to kind of disentangle a lot of this intellectual language when they're just referring to Christian charity. There's another book, Venice as the Policy of Mercy, Guilds, Confraternities, and the Social Order, 1250 to 1650 by Richard McKenney, which again is very interesting study of the Venetian guilds and how rather than being part of a sort of patrician master plan to pacify the lower orders, he suggests that these lay organizations, of which there were hundreds from the 13th century onwards, allowed the popolo, the people, to show great levels of self-determination in the economic and religious life, and perform significant charitable work and maintained the social order. And for him, what he identifies is that the center of the confraternity life, the scholae, was this idea of mercy, a kind of glue holding both the members of each confraternity and the wider community together. And this principle of misericordia had, he says, is an element of self-interest. There's the modern reading back the materialist paradigm into the Christian social order. But it has this reciprocity. In good times, members pay their dues to the brotherhood, perform acts of charity, in the expectation of receiving help in their own moments of trouble, being visited and cared for the sick. So this is the typical thing of modern scholars trying to articulate love of your neighbor.
Right. Well, there's a general modern presumption that there's no such thing as the common good, right? So there's altruism, which is the other person's good, and then there's self-interest, which is my good. But what's missing from this, in the same way that we have private property, which is property for me, and public property, which is property for everyone, but sort of property for the state, but nothing in between, that there's that same missing category of the commons, of the communion, of the family, really. And if you dive into that missing category, you realize, well, there's a kind of good that is for me and for others precisely because we belong to each other, right? The hand isn't envious of the goods that go to the foot because they are members of one body together. And this is where I think, if I had to put my finger anywhere where I think, well, this is where modern scholarship always seems to trip up, is describing relations in the common good as tit for tat relationships. So saying that it's the same thing to say, well, we all belong to a body, which means that to do good for my brother is to do good for me because we belong to each other. That's one way of thinking. The other way is to say, well, I'm going to minimize my individual risk by giving paying my basically paying my premiums, so that I can benefit later.
Right.
And it's difficult because they're similar, and obviously it's the case, and simply historically it was the case, that you can pervert the view of the commons into the view of sort of calculated self-interest. But the idea that these are the only categories in which people can operate seems to be one of those presumptions. I mentioned two other things that they kind of bridge a certain gap between the discussion of guilds as centers of piety and then of charity, which is the way in which the confraternities and guilds would tend to circulate sacred images. So often it would be a guild named after a certain saint, and it would be the responsibility of one family to have the image that was associated with the saint and the feast day, and would venerate it in their home, sometimes for the full year, sometimes it was divided up differently. And these were the same images that would be a part of Corpus Christi processions. And so there's this way in which what membership within what people are doing is diversifying the appearance of Christendom. It's like, what does it look like to belong to the church? Well, as you kind of go down the fractal layers of belonging, you end up in saying, well, it looks like holding a banner of Saint Dominic on this day and being able to represent myself as belonging to a sort of body within a body within a body within a body. This confraternity, which is in this parish, belongs to this church, and I think that's I think when we discuss solidarity, we have to always remember that belonging itself is a gift we give to each other. Like, it's not simply this or that care, this or that benefit that can accrue because we belong to this or that society, but the mere fact of belonging is a joy. It's a joy to represent yourself as being part of something larger than yourself. Everyone knows this. And it seems like a lot of modern life is vainly looking for ways in which we can represent ourselves as belonging to something larger than ourselves in a really tangible manner. I mean, this all gets fed into the language of, I think, political identity these days. Becomes very important to be able to stand not just as this bare individual, but as someone that somehow sums up a larger body in themselves and can then appear before the world kind of clothed, as it were. But Christendom already understood this. I mean, this was, if anything, this was the main spirit. If you get past all of these different benefits, you have the primary benefit that some scholars have said simply defines the Middle Ages as opposed to modernity, which is representation. You, in your person, get to represent more than yourself. Your life becomes iconic, transcendent. You're not just you are something bigger, and that's wonderful. And the place where I see this sort of spilling from just a sort of piety into a public work is in the mystery cycles, which we talked a little bit last time, but the all across Europe, the tradition of having plays depicting the major events of salvation history were always sponsored by various guilds and confraternities. So each guild or confraternity would tend to take some major part of the cycle of salvation history, like, the boat builders would do Noah's flood or whatever it was. And, you got to think this must have been good fun. It must have involved people, not in just this or that self-interested thing, but in an exciting, like, we are going to be represented by all of these props, by all of this, these actors, this costuming. It involved people in like a sort of exciting competition almost to put on the best mystery cycle play. But that would have also been a major part of all of these people's lives, is simply planning for this, very joyous, festive sort of reflection on the life of salvation. And, I'm becoming more and more aware from my own little place in Steubenville how much having festival and having having how festival is economy in some way. An economy is festival, like the gathering together of people for the exchange of things is best done as a sort of festival. And it seems like this was understood implicitly in the actions of the guilds in Christendom.
Well, that would be Joseph Pieper's theory that also related to their work. You cannot have festivity without good work, and that you can't have festivity without a sacrifice. So the members of a small community would have been well aware that winter was coming, and that for us to eat up some of the storehouse now for the sake of it's a literal sacrifice, an offering in faith of something of value for good reason, from good work, for good work, reason to sacrifice. We have there's something that is funny that happens when we do these small farm retreats here at our farm. People come from all over, which is awkward when they first show up. And then we tend to do some work together, which immediately binds them. And then we kill a pig and eat it, which it turns into a party in quick order. That there is something about that sort of cycle as a whole. I know that's kind of a snapshot weekend experience, hopefully not too artificial, because the pig is real. I mean, that blood is not fake. And there is a sort of joy that I have been able to share with people that is as wonderful as every other fish fry is. It's just good to be together. There is something about sharing a work and sharing a place and then sharing a pig that is sacrificial, that brings out a true festivity. I'm teaching my children to play. I'm sorry, other people are teaching my children to play music, so we can add that. I have nothing to offer them, nothing. I'll grow the pigs. Of course, yeah. My daughter has recently read the history in Appalachia of skinning cats and using their guts to make banjos. So I'm trying to just dissuade her from that. But what I mean is that this is not, on the one hand, this seems so far from our experience of, we're going to live the liturgy more fully, which, like, when my wife gets these homeschool catalogs, and I do mean my wife because they seem to be only addressed to her as if I don't exist in the home. And we're just sort of coloring book theming everything instead of something really bubbling up from who we are and what we do, being uncontrollable feasts. There is something different about having to, anyway, we can talk later. I can talk more about the, experience right here in our little spot. I don't want to get ahead of where you're guiding us, Mr. Howard.
Well, it's interesting. Those mystery plays, as I'm sure you know, had a Trinitarian character in that you'd have the mystery plays of the old dispensation, the mystery plays of the gospel, and the mystery plays of the life of the saints.
Yeah,
you would have that cycle from the age of law to the age of grace. Yeah,
and there's even some. Sorry to interrupt. There's even some local church law. I'm sorry, I don't have any citation for this. Hopefully, someone can provide it. But where they had to clarify that you could not hold these plays in the place of a homily during the Mass. So sometimes you think the medievals because you presume, well, they must be like, they're like the trads, but it's global traddom or something. That's the Middle Ages. But then you read something like that, it's like, no, the peasants had to be told to stop putting on the plays
during Mass.
The homily. But you realize how natural that must have been to be, as you say, undergoing a sort of Trinitarian catechesis. It was like there was one world they were living in. It wasn't. The world was a kind of catechesis on the Trinity, and so their response makes good sense. But you were telling me more about the mystery.
Yeah, well, on that, I mean, medieval liturgy and festivity was incredibly kinetic. I was reading about the town I grew up in, or the city, Salisbury. They would suspend a choir boy from the nave who would sing the Gloria on Christmas, the Feast of Christmas. He would represent an angel. So yeah, they were pretty dramatic affairs. But it's Joseph Pearce's thesis that for a young William Shakespeare attending the mystery plays in his youth in, I think, Coventry, a number of other cities put on by the guilds, informed his dramatic imagination. And so you can see there the fruits are not just, the medieval mystery plays, but into early modernity with, the greatest playwright the world has ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Of course. And it was the mystery plays that, like the guilds, were suppressed within the Protestant regime. And so you can see that sort of how that these things that might not appear integral to us certainly did appear integral in opposition to Catholicism, to the Protestants at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly where I wanted to lead our discussion. That sadly, the first nation in the first nation to really suppress the guilds systematically was formerly Merry England, following the Protestant Reformation. So Shakespeare witnessed those mystery plays in his youth under the Marian Restoration, but they would be quickly suppressed. And the reason for this, I think Rosser touches on it at the end of his book, was the Protestant rejection of praying for the dead, which ended one of the primary functions of the guilds, these purgatory societies. And then later on, you've got the another English heresiarch, Thomas Hobbes, saying that in the ideal commonwealth, there is no legitimate space for voluntary or local associations.
Right.
In the Leviathan, such bodies are worms in the entrails of a natural man.
Wow. That's a good one.
Yeah, so it's the individual and it's the Leviathan state.
The state.
Mm-hmm.
In other countries, well, there's an irony here, because the eventual destruction of the guilds, in a certain sense, is achieved by one of the guilds sort of metastatizing into the Freemasons. And Rosser touches on how the oaths sworn by members to maintain the interests and preserve the secrets of the guilds was a perennial sticking point with the clergy. And perhaps that feeds in, I mean, I'm sure that does feed into the Masonic degrees and secrecy. But basically for the Baroque Catholic nations, we see this concurrence of the revolution against Christian monarchies, the disestablishment of the Catholic Church, of Catholicism as the public religion, the abolition of feudalism, and then the dissolution of the guilds. They all seem to sort of go together the same sort of time in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak as directly as you can to the historical progression of the dissolution, but I follow the thought of Andrew Willard Jones, who in several places has pointed out really what should be the obvious, which is that the story of modernity is the story of the centralization of power into the hands of the state, and really the invention of the state as the sole legitimate source of authority, and the gradual equation, or rather the gradual dissolution of the idea of justice into the idea of might making right, which leads to the construction of nation states as we know them today. I mean, if you look at France as sort of the perennial example, where you have a society that's like a quilt, diverse, and this isn't simply cosmetic. This is diverse sources of authority. I mean, he talks about, Andrew in his book Before Church and State brings up cases where abbots are suing the king because it was their right to try a criminal on their property and hang him themselves as a, you know what I mean? So there was this sense of not by any means this kind of placid, immobile arrangement, but there is a sense that justice and authority and governance belong to all of us, and that what we are after is the right order, which included monarchy, which included the monarch, but was in no way somehow, the monarch was never considered in the sense of absolutism as like somehow being the source of all authority and everyone else just being a delegate of him. I mean, this was the beginning of modernity, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea of the guilds, I mean, we discussed in our last podcast that guilds were in some way fulfilling that very this word of Jesus Christ, or rather, I'm sorry, a word of Paul, which is that we should be ashamed to go to court with each other before the Gentiles. Rather, the church should be able to resolve conflicts in our own way, to pursue justice in our own way. This was really being fulfilled in guild organizations, especially as they grew larger, that they would have their own courts to resolve disputes between members. I'm thinking especially of the Spanish story here, but it was general. That presence of adjudicating authority that found its justification not by any reference to an exterior state that gave it license to do so, not by reference to any charter or constitution in which it found its part, not in any extrinsic sense, but precisely because of its real care for a common good, that because we are all members of a body that is after a common work and has a common life, that governance is brought into that. The governance is a part of that. And it was simply a no-brainer that would involve adjudication, for instance. But you can see just by looking at it how, and really this is all in that Leviathan quote that you gave us, you can see how this would have been anathema to the project of state building, where all power is centralized, where there can't really be a dispute when it comes to the law, or there can't be this idea of diverse laws, as it were, the law of the guild making one decision and the law of the king making some other decision. While this made total sense of Christendom and it was organized around this principle, this is what we lost moving into modernity, with this idea of power itself having a kind of what people will later call a monopoly on legitimate violence. That there is one sort of sovereign power from which all other so-called authorities are really just delegates, which, yeah, I mean, Hobbes laid it out best. And I still think we see that problem today because we live within nations. Again, France is a great example of this because all diversity was sort of very directly moved into uniformity. So there is a diverse use of the French language, which by the time of Napoleon was being suppressed, so that Parisian French became the only legal, literal suppression of customs and poems and language and literature. And then there was the kind of universal conscription of men into army. Again, and then as other nations are warring with Napoleon, they're starting to imitate France's leaps and bounds towards building up that sovereign state. But you can see how there's two different visions at play here and how they could never have coexisted.
Well, Rosser makes an interesting point that in England, there were moments of tension between the guilds and the crown. Mm-hmm. But in general, for quite a long time, because I think one of the charges that he brings up that reading backwards is that, well, the only reason they needed guilds in the first place was because the state was so weak. And therefore, as the state became strong, then that's why they had to get rid of the guilds. The only truth in that is that a lot of times we think, particularly in England, that the suppression of the guilds was primarily religious, which of course it had to be, doing things like praying for the poor souls in purgatory and so on. And many of the devotions they just had to go. They had to go. But it was also political, and that's, Christopher Dawson's, what is the book? The Dividing of Christendom. That the dividing of Christendom religiously is at the same time the rise and the solidification of the sovereign nation state as we know it today. We just can't imagine England Italy, Spain, France, the way that they would have understood themselves. Just that in our home, we were trying to have the conversation about, how even in, Milan, Rome, the different rights, different kingdoms, different cities understanding themselves. But it was interesting that once the crown in England decided to not just be an authority, but the authority, particularly after, becoming God, with all religious laws, that then it wasn't long after that the tension between the guilds was just too much to take, and they had to get rid of it, except for a few that were completely practical and pragmatic and utilitarian economic. But at that point, they rapidly go downhill. And what's interesting to me is that we keep bringing up this membership. The nature of the membership was a family, which makes more sense than merely shared or delegated power, which is where a lot of times when we think of subsidiary and all that, is just, well, they should just leave lower governments alone as if they're of the same nature, but just on a lower level.
Right.
But the reality is, no, it's that they actually are a body of which people are members. They actually are a family. Just as a man should not be forced to act against his own body, that the abstraction of authority completely to the state, where the choices are either the individual, so hyper-liberalism and the individual freedom, or the state. Those are the two options. And we're just sort of vying for power, don't tread on me in between these two things, doesn't give way to the idea of a body, of a family at all. That, well, we would not expect people to do something that causes harm to their own body. So if that local community belongs to one another as a body and operates as a body, they would not do things that harm one another, which that helps us to understand why the guilds would have been preserving a way of life in a people that, of course, would have intertwined economic reality, but would have not caused harm to themselves in their way of life. They would have preserved it.
Yeah.
And that requires economic limitations. And I don't know if I brought up last time, if this is repetitive, I'll make it very fast. But the Wendell-Berry's constant thing that he points back to is something that he knew that his father was a part of as a lawyer, the Burley Tobacco Cooperative in Kentucky, where the members limited their production, because farmers have a terrible tendency of growing themselves out of production. They always overproduce to their own destruction. And that the Burley Cooperative, for decades and decades and decades, limited and combined and worked with the farmers so that all of them acted as a body and protected one another in the prices, and that they were one of the only in the United States places where a way of life as farming persisted through the pretty rapid industrialization of agriculture, so that their way of life was not destroyed. And it was because, in a sense, the laity, and not the experts, not the outside forces, protected themselves. So I say all that the choice now between the individual or the state seems to be all we can discuss. Whereas if we understood one another, and again, this is why the guilds cannot be replicated in a secular context at all, or a purely economic context at all, that they're firstly religious, and at least having the philosophical approach that I actually do belong to this person that's next to me, which is a complete act of good. I know you were talking about the historical timeline, but also in what we are, that is something different. And it is the rise of the nation state that sees itself in opposition to these local families, just as Alan Carlson, great author in the United States. Mr. Howard, you should go towards him next, Alan Carlson. But he says, he just mentions in passing very often in his books that it just seems that the state is always at tension with the family, not individuals, but with the family itself.
Yeah, and I think throughout the Middle Ages, you can obviously point to these moments of tension between the diverse sources of authority, which is what you would probably expect, right? Like until the kingdom of heaven is fully established. But what happens is we have, again, this idea of history tending towards, by its nature, tending towards the production of the sovereign state as the end of history. And so what we tend to do is imagine, okay, well, you have authority in the church, sort of the papacy, and then you have the king, and then you have these organizations, and they must all want to be the sovereign. Like, this is the presumption. And so whenever we see the tension, it's always a battle of sovereignty. Like is the Pope going to be the absolute sovereign in the scenario, or is it going to be the king, or is there going to be a battle? But what you realize immediately is that while in the construction of modernity, this actually becomes true, right? Like this does become people's motivation precisely because they are now inspired not by ideals of a universal justice spreading through the whole world, but by the idea of a centralized power as the only real sort of operation of power, being centralization. That this is true of a period of history, but it's simply not necessarily true beforehand. And so we find enough evidence in the construction of modernity to then argue that the world always was modernity. But it's especially apparent, you look at, again, from before Church and State, Andrew's bringing up these stories of peasants suing the king because, over these trivial issues of custom. Well, they would seem trivial, but they were obviously very important. For instance, he brings up a story where the king's men stop some peasants because customarily they've always only ever taken one bundle of sticks out of the king's woods over here, and now they're taking two. They go to a parliamentary court, and it is argued successfully that they sometimes took two bundles of sticks, sometimes one. And so the king's men have to back off, and the peasants. But this wasn't the peasants vying for sovereignty. I mean, if to sort of read that into it is ridiculous. That what they're vying for together is peace. And as anyone knows who's tried to establish peace within a multitude, this is going to involve tensions of borders, questions of what authority is where and how is it enacted. But the end point, if you will, is harmony between all of these different sources of authority. It is not the collapsing of all these different sources of authority into a singular winner of a battle for authority that's been waged over time. And the guilds, I think, were a primary representation of just of power being in the hands of the laity in a specific limited sense, which could not stand the rise of modernity.
And you brought it up earlier. You should tie it back in. I do think it is central to understand that they had common goods.
Yeah, right.
That they had these goods in common. Now we have, and I think there is no way. I know this will make people feel very nervous in America. There is no way for us to have true relationship in the fullest Christian sense with our neighbors that are Catholics. Let's say, let's not just say vague, but my actual Catholic neighbors. If all of us live in complete isolation, professionally and financially, and Jeff Bezos sends us all of our goods. If there's nothing that we can pursue and hold in common, even if it's a shared apostolate at the least, it makes it very hard to be at any sort of community, have any sort of, and I don't mean, I'm scared to use, I hear voices, the people like, oh, that just sounds like, no, it's not fluff. We genuinely thrive on our need. We genuinely live off in love with God and with one another. We need that, and the sharing and holding of goods in common together. And I don't mean what a lot of us think that means, which is simply I will have less of something because you have some of it, but something that we genuinely pursue together and hold in love together, and therefore care for it together.
Yeah, I think the vision you get to ultimately in modernity is that you can have anything you want to call community as long as you can always call the cops on each other. And then it's allowed, right? And what's being posited in the Middle Ages is not something where the sort of, the idea of a police force that's sort of taking care of individuals is somehow absent. But in the sense that it really does belong to people. Like, it's not an extrinsic representative of the state solely. It's like, if we are going to belong to each other as members of a body, if we're going to have a common work, then it also means that one of the things that's going to be sanctified, one of the things that's going to be part of our common life is the work of enforcement, policing, like calling each other to account, punishment, the use of authority. I mean, these things were not things that people were scared of. In fact, if the record shows anything, it's that the people in the Middle Ages were very concerned that their capacity to enforce, to keep law, on whatever small level they operated it, as it were, that they really strove for this to be recognized, and that if they ever got offended, it's because not because their abstract rights were being trampled on, but because their authority was being trampled on. But I think
their relationship was being violated as well. I think they're
right, absolutely. But I think we're maybe for lack of my historical knowledge, I've tended the conversation to the abstract. I'm not saying that the history of it was, a couple of people knocking on the guild's door and saying, "Sorry, but we have a theory of sovereign power now, and you guys are the old guard."
It's all pertinent, because rationalism is the prioritization of ideas over things, over realities, over corporate bodies. And this occurred during the so-called Enlightenment, with when liberals, with their rationalist conceptions, couldn't stand the economic prejudices of the Ancien regime, the thick social fabric, particularly in urban life, that regulated unbridled commerce. And that's why they were such a target. And they were a target before the French Revolution. Back in the same year as your Declaration of Independence, 3 years after the suppression of the Jesuits, not a great period. The guilds were partially suppressed by the French crown, by Turgot, who abolished corporations and left them weakened and ill-prepared to meet their final attack by the French Revolution, their final abolition. In Spain, they're targeted along with entailed estates, again, the family dynamic, as a hindrance and a estorbo to progress, and abolished in 1834. So we have the artisan craftsman becoming the itinerant factory wage slave in the 19th century, and this new commodified relationship between employer and employee. And so that by the time of Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII writes, quote, "Such associations, guilds, should be adapted to the demands of the age in which we live, an age of greater education, of different customs, and of far more numerous demands in daily life. It is gratifying to see that everywhere associations of this nature are being formed today, either those composed only by workmen or those with employees and employers together. We greatly desire that they become more numerous and more efficient. Although we have spoken of them more than once, we want to explain here how much they are needed, their right to exist, as well as indicate what should be their organization, their program of action." End quote. Now, you've touched on the idolatry of the state being the highest natural creation of man, and therefore very, very likely to become an idol for apostatized Western man. Now, I see today, despite numerous difficulties with Catholic courtship and family formation, nevertheless, we are seeing the formation of faithful Catholic families. We are seeing the beginning of a reconstitution of a disparate society of households. So I think it's now pertinent to start thinking about what's next. And what's next are local economies, local societies, voluntary associations like the guilds. So we can start thinking about the restoration of working associations like guilds. I've argued before that given the hegemony and malevolence of Babylonian structures at the moment, that building parallel economies and parallel societies is incumbent on us. Success within the regime is no longer a moral prospect, by and large. So this is something that I think maybe baby boomer or Generation X parents struggle to see, but for their child to become a management consultant or a government worker, go to work for regime media, work for a Globo Homo corporation, it's not, they will be tasked with being part of building anti-Christendom, basically. So, yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts about how we can restore these working associations? I know that you're both involved in efforts to do that.
Who wants to go first? You had the audacity to question the idea that somehow Catholics can sort of integrate with the regime here and come out even more Catholic than before, which is an argument that's often met with the argument that somehow to express this opinion is to be afraid of power itself for some reason, as opposed to what seems to be obvious, which is to ask the question of, well, where is power really efficacious? Like, if we have this thing called power, how do we actually use it to get real results and not keep bashing our heads into the wall? I think that there is something to be said for going back to the roots of these institutions and building up the solidarity that has been demolished in modernity from the ground up, as it were. So what I mean is, it seems like on a immediate level, it is very simple to say to friends, to a neighborhood, hey, let's cover each other's funeral costs. Let that be a part of our life. So let's form a group. Let's sign on the dotted line if that's what makes everybody feel good, and let's share funeral, burial costs, and let's pray for the souls of those who die together. And it seems like if we don't actually establish these kinds of communities on a personal level, we'll never be working with the same spirit and the same resources, to use a bad word here, that our Christian forefathers were working with. Like, if we're always trying to start from the existing corporation and say, okay, this is a union organized, for instance, this is a trade union organized for getting the most money out of a capitalist employer as possible in a war of all against all. Our efforts to say, well, let's make this form of community into something that like, it is not designed, it is not in place to produce the kinds of ends that we're looking for distributions of justice, for greater peace throughout the whole society, for the ability to live a integrated Catholic life. The various institutions the world has to offer are very often put in place precisely to ensure that the natural motivations towards Christianity are suppressed from the outset. So you feel the bubblings of solidarity within your heart, and you get shunted immediately into working for a trade union whose whole structure is simply enmity between capital and labor, for instance. Or, you feel the call of Christian charity, and you bubbles up in your heart, and so you're faced, in America at least, with the whole nonprofit or NGO world as the fulfillment of your desire, while of course that fulfillment only comes at the cost of integrating the work of charity into the tax regime of the state, at which point it
tends to lose whatever made it Catholic from the beginning. Not to say that these various institutions are somehow impossible to be good in, as if it was simply verboten to the Catholic. But at the same time, we have to understand that modernity suppresses Christianity through its major institutions and not somehow as a sort of esoteric spirit floating above these institutions. And so there is a demand not simply to sanctify this or that bureaucracy, but to in fact begin forms of communion that do not have the goals of modernity, especially obviously the suppression of the church, as their basis, but have the goals of the church as their basis. I keep on thinking of this example of the fact that people gathered money for burial costs, and then because they had that money, were able to give interest-free loans to members of a confraternity. You have a very plausible example of something you could do with a group of people, which I don't think is really possible otherwise. Like, you have to first have the foundations of trust, of love, of mutual solidarity and communion in order to then imagine larger institutions of, say, usury-free loaning, which would be possible precisely because the ground of community is real. So that was a long, maybe too theoretical reality, but I guess the first thing that I would say is just do not shirk the reality of the faith, the spiritual communion as being the source of these material and economic benefits. Because if we just try to get the material and economic benefits, we hate global capitalism, wouldn't it be so good if we could organize ourselves into a group that can, fix prices and protect workers and all this? Those are good motivations, but if we do it without actually having communion together, if we don't actually convert from the idea that we're individuals in ruthless competition with other individuals under a homogenous state, then these things will fall apart, as they so often have. Okay, so that's my introduction to it.
Jason. Well, I would, let's bring it right back down because, so I'm definitely speaking from, I know distributism, at least in the United States, is being rapidly rebranded as localism because we just can't take that word, of course. But that the great practical and spiritual reality of loving your neighbor, especially the household of faith, is not nearly as hard as we think it is. So in our community, just two efforts I can speak of here is that we actually do have a very loose, we haven't met regularly, but we have very loosely chartered, we signed papers and we called it a guild. I won't give its name away in case we get hunted down by a SWAT team, that just assesses financial needs of people within the community, financial willingness of people within the community, and matches those up. Everything from purely or someone who is down and out in need of help. So as they talked about, some of the guilds had a requirement: you have to bring a pauper with you to the feast, and then to investing in local businesses that have direct and obvious value within our community. And we care about that. We have people, I have done my best when land becomes available to get it in Catholic hands with a sort of shared understanding that we are slowing the progress that surrounds us. It's kind of a funny thing in my community. We had the experience of the state DOT deciding they were going to widen the road. And what's hilarious about it is a road that if you were to ask anyone in my county, what is one road that does not need to be widened? And it's Highway 9 between 74 and 108, completely unnecessary. They're doing it anyway. So we're constantly sort of fighting this progress, which really, by progress, and by fighting progress, I mean, we're just trying to keep KFC out. Just small things. As far as Catholics, though, in the United States, we actually have, and this is, I'll use the example that we're pursuing right now with our farm. So there is right here within, so I'm looking out my window across the street. So there is a Catholic who's starting a butcher shop. And then out my other window this way is a dairy barn. So I have dairy he has meat. And then a half a mile that way is actually a Protestant fella, great guy who has vegetables. And he's a commercial vegetable grower. I met him at a farmer's market about an hour from here. So we have a steady and serious and professionally produced or produced by craftsmen, we'll put it that way, of meat, vegetables, dairy, and eggs right here. So the problem is all of us face regulations that are made for that are written for and exist within the tension between industry and government. So factories and regulators. And so the laws are ridiculous. And I know this because I was, for a while, the smallest grade A dairy in North Carolina, and navigating these ridiculous laws that were written for a factory when I am, nothing. And so examples of, I went and got an operating permit on an outhouse. So a closet over a hole outside on an outhouse. I went and got an operating permit on it because the inspector said, well, if you have an operating permit for a bathroom, then you can be a commercial food operation. So you have to read the laws carefully and find out, well, I don't have another $5 to $10 grand for a bathroom and a septic tank, but I have a closet over a hole outside. And I happen to know in the state of North Carolina that unless a local ordinance has gone against it, you can get an operating permit for an outhouse. So I went down to the county and I said, I'd like an operating permit for an outhouse. And they said, well, we don't have plans for that. I said, well, I do. And I handed it to them. And they said, fine. And they approved it. And the regulator approved it. So all those regulations are draconian and difficult. We can't overcome them. But this little association, we're forming what's called a private membership association, which has been protected over and over and over in the United States, all the way up to the Supreme Court, where we have the freedom to associate as neighbors, as people, to do whatever we want in some ways to take care of our own business, what we're about. So this is how country clubs, United States, by the way, in a dry county can have alcohol. They become drinking clubs. So between having a PMA, so in my case, I would be able to sell raw milk to customers that want to purchase raw milk because they're a part of my membership association. This is protected by the United States Constitution. The North Carolina Constitution also has the rights to the fruits of your labor clause in the Constitution, which every time in recent years when it gets challenged, despite the liberal leaning increasingly in North Carolina, every time these laws get challenged in our state, they are always siding with those of us homesteaders, small businesses, the right to the fruits of our labor, that we can find ways to sell our goods and services to our neighbors without interference. So forming those small associations it's available. And in some ways, yes, they are parallel. Reading the laws carefully, gathering with people to find a way to do it. This is very different, I think, than what Mark was getting about much larger, much more powerful bureaucratic, unions versus the corporations and all of that. On a local level, we actually have an amazing amount of freedoms left that we just don't have the imagination or the stomach to actually pursue. So we're not. And it's almost strange and crazy how easy it is for us to have these parallel economies and enjoy them and have fun doing it and exchange and then be lucrative and good for everyone involved, and that we can discuss and pursue these things. So much so that a lot of us get lost, I think, in the abstract, where it's kind of like people were talking about being persecuted as Christians on Twitter. But if you don't have Twitter, all of a sudden, magically, you're not persecuted anymore. There's all sorts of. So anyway, sorry, that was getting tangent worthy. My point is, I do think the localism movement and the local economy, particularly from the soil, from the ground up to your particular place, is the simplest way to begin very much the spirit of the Guild, particularly with other Catholics. I'm sure there are other examples within urban and suburban settings that would be possible. Because I live in a rural area and have conversation with other rural living people that have the tools now of communication, that our ability to work is still within the system, meaning our protected freedoms, not merely the capitalist or hyper state control tendencies that we have at our disposal, the freedom to associate. And if you, with the private membership associations, if you associate them with your religion, you even have further protections that can be defensible.
Yeah, this is true. I do think some people will hear this sort of thing and see in it a certain despair in that, well, if it's the case that we simply have within American law a space for freedom in which these parallel economies or parallel societies can be built, so long as they stay within certain limits, so long as we're all clever, so long as the laws don't change, etc. And what I see is that people are aware that there's a contradiction, because, how do I put it? The lie of liberalism is that it's complete and consistent. It's not, actually. It is a claim that sort of that power is sovereign and can't stand any kind of rival, as it were. And then it's a reading of history and of reality and saying that, well, what you are, Jason, is a rival to the sovereign because you're doing all of these things that are off its radar. But insofar as you don't get noticed, you're basically a successful rival. Like you've managed to slip under. And there's an element to that which is true. And I think you're right to suggest, in terms of actually living as parallel societies now, there are tools available to us, and then we should use them, absolutely. But I think what's important to realize is that the Catholic who's doing this has a different world in view than the liberal who's sort of watching him do it, right? Because to the liberal, what's happening is something odd is being allowed, insofar as it doesn't cross these various limitations. But for the Catholic, this is just life, right? There's no the liberal state presents certain obstacles that have to be surmounted, but these are obstacles like any obstacle. You figure out ways to get around them, and you go ahead and do it. But it is not the idea of conformity to a absolute sovereign power. It is, in fact, the practice of real authority, the growing of a real body, a communion that can be represented, that has. So what I mean to say is it's important, and this is just to harp back on the spiritual element of all this. It's important to realize that we are building the church, which is always a rebuke to the kind of absolutist claims that characterize modernity. Mm-hmm. And we're not simply carving out a space in which what we're doing is permitted. We're living life and then waiting for all of these odd ideas about what we're doing to dissipate in the truth of Christ.
I think that would be to think of it as merely, because I was speaking of the PMA, the Private Membership Association, as someone has said, quit calling it a loophole. It's not a loophole.
Right, exactly.
It's not a loophole. You're not looking now selling raw milk as pet food. That's a loophole, right? I've done that too. But actually, what is being declared and what is being lived in that is not something that's filed with any state. Mm-hmm. It isn't. It's just something that if it were to be attacked, then you would find some sort of legal protection. Well, but my point is, start with living. I need. So I just think the simplicity of the exchanges, and I'm agreeing with you. Just start living. Mm-hmm. So my neighbor across the street says we need milk almost every day. I say, well, we're pretty red-blooded here. We need meat every day. So I raise animals. He butchers them, and so that's a big service he has for me. And then the milk, and to exchange those things and to live and to sort of solidify that exchange just doesn't require. Are you in trouble, Jacob? We're talking.
Do you need me?
Don't edit this out. Yeah.
Go ahead, continue.
Yeah, I agree with you. We are not having to carve out and overthink these spaces. It is the best parallel I would say is just when you turn off Twitter, you're no longer persecuted. When we just associate and begin living as Catholics, praying, feasting, eating, and working together. And I don't know how you said it, and waiting for the rest to fall down around us. It's actually a great joy, because the other people that are very interested in what we're doing are preppers, and people that are, I guess, I don't know, fearful of it all collapsing, or maybe pragmatic or prudent. And I don't really have anything against them. It's just not a motivating factor for what I'm doing. It's the joy and the goodness of doing that. I'm not just trying to create, or we ought not to be just trying to get gotcha loophole moments within the law, but I agree, of just living in a completely different approach to life with our children, with our economics, with our education, with all
right,
those
because eventually, so as we've discussed, part of the reason for the dissolution of the guilds is because the state developed an overbloated sense of its own importance, because it had to sort of subsume under itself everything in order to suppress the Catholic Church as a real authority in the world, right? Well, one of the things that the state often forgets, as it were, is that there is no state outside of people. Like, people do this. We make the claims. We believe absolutist sort of politics. We write the constitutions even. And one of the things that, I mean, this is true historically of Christianity, but it's also just obvious, really, is that the Christians are known for how much they love each other. And where that's seen, there's conversion. So where we develop institutions where our love is apparent, we will find the work of conversion so much easier, because we're not here simply to say, all right, give me your 17 rigorous arguments against the doctrines here. We're saying, look at all this love and all this good and come find out where it comes from. And wherever we do that, we're going to convert the world. But as the world converts, we're going to create people who have a very different idea of, for instance, the importance of the state. So you can see what I'm getting at, which is namely that as the state comes from families, it is something that is made by children growing up and believing certain things. And what the kind of life that we're describing here, which is amenable to such things as guilds, is the kind of life that produces children who believe things like there can be diverse sources of authority, for instance, right? Who believe things like peace is possible, right? Who believe things like there's no such thing as the individual. In fact, we are always social, things like this. And this changes the nature of your whole culture, your whole society. And so it's not an argument for, say, quietism or pacifism or some kind of like withdrawal from the reality of the world. It's asking the question of what is the source of the so-called reality of the world? Well, it's people. It's people catechized in a particular way. And what you seem to be advocating and what the guilds seem to embody is a way of life that more easily produces Catholic people.
And you mentioning it being a local body, and that being the means of evangelization. And I think it's important to move towards that, because sometimes are you retreating from the world to live this parallel society? Aren't you supposed to be salt and light? What are you doing way out there? Which the answer to that is always they will be known by their love. I'm amazed how the entire New Testament, every letter after letter after letter, is not about how to go out and send more missionaries. It's actually, no, the missionary was already there, and it's how you now can live. How are you supposed to live with one another? It's the entirety of the New Testament, practically. Everything from stop arguing, don't go to court. Here's a guy who's a former slave, now he's a brother. I mean, all of these very practical issues to these local communities that the church calls her sacraments. When someone wants to join the church, they must be initiated into what? Right. So there must be bodies that say you are now one of us, that have a coherent, local, practical, visible, tangible. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. The most I come from evangelical Protestantism, and people think that it's just their zeal for going out and having a very firm belief in hell, which, that's helpful. But also what they have actually created, if you see and interact with their churches, is very vibrant bodies very vibrant local bodies. That's what makes them very effective. Come join us. So when it comes to the idea that we are retreating, that's very offensive to this whole idea, because the stronger there is a local we, the easier it is to say to someone, you are welcome here.
Yeah. So in answer to your prompt here, Mr. Howard, the establishment of guilds is possible, and indeed, I think it's necessary for the lay Christian now. I mean, there's the great call from the Second Vatican Council that we're supposed to sanctify. The call of the laity, right, is to sanctify the temporal order. And this should be understood as in concert with Rerum Novarum's call to build up institutions of workers' associations that are doing precisely that, which are making justice a norm between them. What it means for us today, it depends entirely on our situation, which is why there can be no real, do this, that, and the other. I can say for my neck of the woods, it's been the establishment of confraternities with the explicit purpose of mutual aid, like burial costs and funeral costs. It has been the establishment of festivals and performance of some of the mystery cycles, things like that. And it's also just been a lot of unplugging from what I would call faux solidarity, right? It's like, okay, because whenever you have some replacement for the good, you never really think you need Christian community. Insurance is a very good sort of way of understanding this. So, right now I'm involved with essentially a mutual aid society that shares health costs. But you only start thinking you need to share health costs between a body of believers who you can all trust not to be cheating the system, as it were, once you're not involved in a health insurance plan. And so there's a work to be done to identify the various, usually profitable structures that keep us from needing each other. It's like, well, I don't really need to organize in community in order to have festival and entertainment, because all my entertainment comes from Amazon, right? I don't really need to share health costs because I have that from the steady, workings of the large corporation that I work for. In each instance, the world provides some kind of faux solidarity where we don't even feel the need for Christianity to be the salt and light, where we say we need Christ here to help us make an institution in order to live and to live well. So one of the things that I advise people to do when they're considering becoming more radical in the faith is to ask the question about what you do for work, whether you really love it, whether it's really part of your vocation, but also ask the question of where you live, and ask whether you live in and if you live in such a way and in such a place where you need community. Like, is it just that all your needs are totally satisfied by money, and then community is this missing sort of luxury item that you can't quite get at with your coworkers yet? Because then you don't feel the need to build institutions of friendship, to take care of needs together. And to my mind, it's worth moving to a place where poverty is more apparent, where needs are more apparent, where life is a little bit harder, like the rural life, as Jason has mentioned, where those problems that we tend to enter into community to find solutions for really need to be met. They're not just being met by money. Because then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to relearn the corporal and spiritual works of mercy and say, oh man, we have to do something. I think necessity is a great help here. Like, we have to figure out how we're going to afford funeral costs, right? We have to figure out who in this situation is going to be with the sick, who's going to visit the sick. We have to share meals, right? Because we're not just doing like a social visit for our own pleasure anymore. It's like we're involved in a body where we actually need each other. I think this is why the popes often praise the idea of poverty of a poor church, is that once you stop becoming the recipient of essentially exploitation that happens elsewhere, gets turned into cash, and then makes your life very comfortable. Once that stops becoming the norm of life, then Christianity returns with all of its necessity. And I think we have to, and I think, to be frank, I think we are going, because of the way we've ordered society, we will all experience that necessity soon. Like, there will be an economic collapse, which will mean that the kind of comfortable life we've had through money won't be possible anymore. And it will be necessary for us to look at each other and say, we need each other. We need to form fraternal institutions that take care of needs, or we're going to hurt, we're going to suffer. Since we're not at that point yet, it seems to me like Catholics should be practicing it now.
Mm-hmm.
And the great thing,
practicing for it. John Senior,
sure.
And I guess it was the restoration of Christian culture. He actually, people like to quote all the, where he talks about Catholics could buy a neighborhood and school their children. It'd be quite easy. And he says later, but we're not willing to embrace the poverty that requires that. Unless there is need, I'm convinced you are absolutely right. Unless there is genuine need for one another, because in prudence, we naturally prepare for future needs. That's fine. If I feel in my bones and know it on paper that my future need is met by insurance and not you, it changes my relationship with you. Just the only reason we're still a dairy is because when we bought 2 dairy cows with our last $1,500 that we had nothing else. And I was getting kicked, and these cows had never been milked and I had never milked. And we people ask, or when we discuss homesteading and farming and things like that, it's very hard to make a homestead real when you don't need it. I've visited friends that I'm like, look at my raised beds. They're beautiful. I'm like, man, that is Pinterest worthy, but there are no plants in that. I mean, you're like $5,000 into this garden, and there's no food. And I will say, doing that with your neighbor and realizing your need for one another and then beginning can be very uncomfortable. There is a man who lives, it's uncomfortable, but it becomes very real, very fast. Like you're describing funeral expenses. There's a man down the road here who started giving me eggs because he knew that we needed like a dozen eggs every day because we have so many kids. So he started bringing them in. I asked him, can I give you money? Can I please pay you for these eggs? And he said, I don't need any money, and he was dead serious. It is just his way of life. I don't need any money. I don't have any bills to pay. He is very self-sustaining. So we started giving him what we had, which is milk. And then he was raising pigs. So we were giving him skim milk from the butter. And then he's giving us sausage. And then what did we give him last? Oh, we gave him some butter. And it has actually, the abundance of our local community has become uncomfortable, where we're really trying to outdo one another in fulfilling these needs. And the result has been, I have more food, the same amount of money, because there's no money being exchanged. And I'll just say, I mean, the affection with this man who I can't outdo and who doesn't need my money, which is where it began. Is the reason I bring up the story is that he legitimately looked me in the eye and without overthinking it the way we are on this podcast, just said, I don't need it. I don't need it. And for his to have a way of life and an outlook to reject something that very legitimately earned money for something he was giving me, and then in that instant, this alternative parallel economy began that just keeps growing.
No, it's very literal. Like you have to not do things for the same reasons everyone else does them in order to have anything different. I mean,
right.
Well, as you were speaking, something struck me. I want to say it, which is that if it's the case that we need our needs to be real, what's beautiful about the church, I think, and perhaps one of the reasons why all of these guilds can be kind of traced back to a spiritual need, to the need for prayer, especially prayers for the dead, and why when they're suppressed, they're ultimately suppressed for praying for the dead, is that the Catholic is one who always stands in need, no matter what. right? Like, even if all of my material needs are met, when I die, I need grace, right? I need mercy. And there's no point at which that's not true. And so what you have, as it were, is a kind of guaranteed poverty to the degree that we celebrate the faith, which is why, again, I stress that you can't simply do this thing without being Catholic, because you can't simply base it on some condition that might be met otherwise. It's like, well, we're going to do this because we all want to keep wages at a certain level. It's like, okay, fine. The Leviathan says that all wages are at the same level. So now where's your community, right? But for the Catholic, what we know fundamentally is that we're in need of each other, right? That we make up what is lacking in the cross of Christ by suffering with each other, by our mutual compassion. And so it seems to me like starting with that need that will never go away until we're dead, is a sort of metaphysically secured poverty. We will always have the poverty of our own nature. We will always need Christ, so we'll always need each other. And so the beginning of these guilds, which began sort of at the top, paradoxically, even as they began at the bottom, which is what is the ultimate need we have? Well, it's for prayer. So why do we organize? Well, for prayer, for the honor of the saints, for masses said for the dead. And then to see that being the sort of fundamental source of our communion with each other, and then everything else being a kind of, almost like a materialization of that need, of that poverty of the human person. It's like, well, not only do I need your prayers, but I also need your potatoes. Like, not only do I need my soul to be saved, but I also need to learn the craft of leatherworking, or whatever it is, whatever the guild protects and teaches. So again, like, it's very painful, because it's very tempting for Catholics to want to grab at the part of our social life that the world likes, right? Like, oh, cool, you're organizing to have, master apprentice relationships pass on handicraft or something. Yeah, we like that. We can imagine that. We can put that in a movie. But for us to not be so tempted to simply materialize it, but to remember that ultimately the need is total. It's for salvation. And so that need is always there. There's always a reason. I don't
want to inspire a part 3 of this, Theo, because this could go. But my question is, as I'm listening to you, it seems, though, that it's been quite easy, that is the only way that Catholics associate would be the holy hour. I almost think that branching outward from the devotional life is the part that we haven't done, more than forgetting.
Yeah, but Jason, I'd argue back that we don't actually pray. I mean, what I mean is we have, on the one hand, yeah, you're right. Like, the things that get us together is like going to church, as it were. But that wasn't what happened with the organization of the confraternities. What happened was that we felt the need for masses to be said after we die. Like, that was so real to us that we were willing to establish an institution, right, that we were beholden to doing the same for our brothers. That we do not do, right? That's weird. Even if you stand up after the holy hour and say, hey, everyone, I was thinking about pledging myself to say masses if you die. Would you say it for me if I die? That's odd. And so what I mean is, we're not taking seriously the corporate nature of salvation.
That I agree. So, that I would agree with. And even as I say it, though, it's not true. We will go to holy hours together, but it does not result in a deeper living the fact of the mystical body of Christ, which is the doctrine we're discussing. Is the mystical body of Christ, are being bound to one another.
Well, right, yeah, because it's precisely what's being denied in modernity, right? It's that is that we don't really belong to each other, right? That our unity is a unity of violence. We war with each other because we're all individuals, And then anything that looks like peace is just that all those individuals sort of at stasis points.
Right. No, it's or as Aquinas says, the world can have concord, but only the Christian brothers can have peace. So I think we very often have concord, which the way I witness it repeatedly is that there can be associations and gatherings of friends that have shared interest or shared economic, they're alike. Natural friendship on the natural level, the first level of friendship. But in the apostolate of Fraternus, it is a point at the beginning that we make is that we are not presuming when you gather here for brotherhood that you're friends. You might not like one another, but this is how you know you've moved from death to life when you love the brotherhood, as St. John put it. So that is the harder lesson to learn, I say, particularly for American men of a conservative sort of belonging to one another in a way that is somehow tangible and real, and not just co-religionists. As much as I like that word, I still like the word co-religionist.
Yeah, the peace of Christ through the reign of Christ. And this is, it seems to so often come down to this fundamental problem that one observes among Catholics and among traditional Catholics as well, which is seeing the faith as a part of life rather than the form of life itself in which it unfolds, which is the product of modernity's sad, tragic transformation of religion. As I invite you both to maybe offer your final thoughts, I know that, Mr. Barnes, you're establishing a college of St. Joseph the Worker, which seems to be pertinent for the revitalization of the trades. Perhaps you could say something about that.
Yeah, sure. The College of St. Joseph the Worker is a trade school in Steubenville that graduates its students with mastery in a trade and a BA degree in Catholic Studies, hoping to form both the body and the spirit, as it were, but also to graduate students with no debt, so that instead of the sort of crippling dependence on I think you called it Babylon at some point. I like that. You can begin with a greater degree of freedom. And the trades, especially, which is to say ownership of a skill, which involves ownership of property, which involves community, which involves responsibility, because you're not simply able to be a cog within a money-making machine, but you actually have to deal with reality. There's a reason why we can imagine, as it were, the trades confraternity, but we can't really imagine like the corporate white-collar confraternity, as it were, because in order to really understand real community, you have to really be engaged with reality. And this is why one of my recommendations for so many people is simply to take your work seriously. Like, stop saying that your job is just your job that provides you with money for some other thing. But if that is the case, you should be suffering it. Like, you should be a point of suffering that your work is not a part of the life of the church, but is somehow you having to fund the life of the church later after you finish your 9 to 5 or whatever it is. So yeah, the actual restoration of the trades, which the college seeks to do, is necessary. If there's going to be this real kind of common life, there has to be real kinds of work. This would open up a whole new discussion, but I think it's fairly evident on the face of it that where the world is increasingly financialized, so that more and more people spend their time and talent and energy in figuring out how to make money and how to make that money make more money. The presupposition that everyone is an individual at war for sovereignty becomes true in their lives. It becomes believable. It becomes day to day, almost humdrum to imagine that. Whereas once you turn away from that sort of work and towards reality, which always involves some kind of gift to one's neighbor, then that does not become a believable statement. A way to put it pithily is that for a guy on Wall Street, Hobbes makes sense, and for a plumber, he doesn't. because they have just different realities in front of them. And it seems to be that the goal of modernity is to create more and more people for whom the philosophy of liberalism simply makes sense. They're changing the world to make the philosophy work.
We've discussed how friendship, brotherhood, moral economy, the customs of the guild gave rise to law.
Mm-hmm.
And this is precisely what the Babylonian power structure today hate and fear. They want labor as a commodity. It would represent an assault on their idols in their temple, like you've written, Mr. Barnes, about Amazon funding abortions. So they would target an effort in this direction. But I don't know if you know an author called Rory Groves, who wrote a book for Front Porch Republic, Durable Trades.
Yeah.
You're interviewing him soon. And I think he's a Protestant, but I think his analysis of durable trades, of those professions that have been resilient throughout from the pre-industrial era to today, it's highly useful for young men in particular thinking about which trades to enter. Mm-hmm. Or fathers passing on advice and so on. It's a very practical guide, and it seems to be that your college is kind of meeting that interest as well.
Yeah, I mean, the 5 trades that we focus on, no one has figured out how to automate yet. And I don't think they will anytime soon.
Right.
No, that's it. You cannot export the job of plumber to China. It just will never happen. It's just something about it. Yeah, I'm glad you're interviewing Rory and Mark. You guys should definitely get him up there. Absolutely. The durable trades, he rates all of these trades based on their accessibility, family friendliness, longevity, how long they've been around historically. You can be a lawyer today, and St. Thomas More was a lawyer. That's a pretty resilient job, whereas writing code might not to be.
It's not exactly. It's not just blue collar profession. It's enduring white collar professions as well. Even a banker, we need Catholic bankers to lend without interest. But it's comprehensive, and I like, as you point out, Mr. Craig, that he talks about its family centeredness, that the ability to involve one's spouse and even children and pass on that heritage, which touches on what we've discussed as well.
All right.
So, gentlemen, it's been an incredibly edifying discussion. I've learned a lot, and I thank you for your time, your erudition. Perhaps you could share with the listeners, just before you go, where they might access your scholarship, your writing, your work at the moment.
Yeah, so for me, you can go to newpolity.com, which is a magazine, as well as an online blog, as well as some podcasts that we hope only briefly grab your attention online, and then encourage you to go offline and to be not afraid, especially not afraid of your own power and your own desire to build institutions that themselves are parts of the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Satan. That's us.
Great. You can go. I don't know if this is how we became friends through the interwebs, Mark, or it was Jacob. No, actually, who's the guy behind the scenes that does all the work for you? Alex.
Alex is the
Alex Call. Yeah. So we have a magazine. Sword&Spade is the magazine, and it's very much these ideas that our issues are geared, especially towards the working and providing father and his household. So just challenging certain things of liberalism, like, are you setting your kids up for succession in your community or for success out in the global world, or things like that, living festivity. So, but it's very much geared towards households and local communities. And then it's also related to Fraternus, which is a mentoring apostolate that I'm a part of. So the swordandspade.com. I think we have an ad for New Polity in there, and vice versa. This last one. No,
we're already involved in some exchanges.
That's right.
The IRS would ask us to calculate the monetary value of it and put it on our taxes.
Our accountant started going, you have ads in here. We have to pay for them. No. We gave it away. It's fine. It's okay. Yeah. But that didn't make her happy either. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm getting the calls now. It's time for dinner.
All righty.